So you can't put two modal verbs in a row. You don't conjugate modal verbs. Modal verbs just keep their base verb. They are not followed by an infinitive. And they are usually in the present tense, and modal verbs act as the auxiliary verb. Hi, today we are talking about modal verbs. And primarily we're focusing on can and should, but I'll show you several of our modal verbs. First of all, you should know that modal verbs are, that there are not that many modal verbs in English, but we use them a lot. So here we go. First, there are some rules to modal verbs that work differently than the verb plus infinitive formation. And I will show you the verb plus infinitive use for the same modal verb. Most modal verbs will also have a way to say it without a modal verb, because modal verbs usually stay in the present tense. We can put some of them in the past tense, but very few. And so they have a counterpart that is not a modal verb, and I'll tell you what that is as well. So we can compare the grammar. So here we go. So you can't put two modal verbs in a row. You don't conjugate modal verbs. Modal verbs just keep their base verb. They are not followed by an infinitive. And they are usually in the present tense, and modal verbs act as the auxiliary verb in the sentence. If you need a negative or a question, you need to use an auxiliary verb. The auxiliary verb is the modal verb. All right, so these are the modal verbs in English. There are not that many of them. We have can, could, may, might, shall, must, shall, will, would, and should. Okay? And here are some of the infinitive counterparts. Modal verbs they can express ability, they can express possibility, they can express obligation, as in must or should. They can express future intention, as in shall or will. And they can express conditional and polite requests. We use would and could. Some people will say that those are the past tense forms of will and can. However, that's not always true. Could is often used to say a conditional of what of an ability. It's also something that we use when we ask politely for something. Could you get me this? Could you get me another drink, please? That's not a past tense, and it's a little closer to the meaning of a conditional. Let's take a look at the individual verbs and how they're used in sentences. Okay? Our first one is, she can speak 3 languages fluently. Now, before I really get into this, I want you to hear me say that again. I said, she can speak. When the modal verbs are rarely stressed in a sentence, she can speak. Okay? The can is very slight when you're listening. The counterpart would be she is able to speak 3 languages fluently. Okay? She can speak 3 languages fluently. She is able to speak 3 languages fluently. This is able to takes the place of the can. But notice now we have a to speak. To speak is the infinitive form. So we know that is able is not a modal verb. Okay? But the meaning between these two, she can speak 3 languages fluently, and she is able to speak 3 languages fluently. The meaning is the same. It's just most people will say can. With a negative sentence, we put the not right here. And let's look at it in the infinitive form too. Okay? So notice in the infinitive, when we're using just regular verbs plus the infinitive, we put the not after the first verb. With she can't speak, these cannot becomes can't, like this. So when we make a contraction, what we're doing is taking letters out and we put an apostrophe in place of those letters. She can't speak 3 languages fluently. Okay? Let's go on to questions. In questions, we already have 2 verbs. So even though this is a present simple sentence, because we have this verb, we can just put it in front here and make it the first one. Can she speak 3 languages fluently? So now it's a question. And if I were to use the verb plus infinitive form rather than the modal form, I would have the is here. Is she able to speak 3 languages fluently? So this is called the infinitive form here, this to speak. This is the can, this is the modal, okay? We use can to indicate things that we can do or things that we can't do. So here, when I say things we can do, it sounds like this. Things we can do. Things we can do. And things we can't do. Things we can't do. And the can't is going to have a stop. Things we can't do. And we emphasize the can't. Things we can do. We de-emphasize the can, but when it's a negative, we emphasize it. Things we can't do. Things we can't do. So that's how you tell if someone says can or can't. We're having a dog day today. So things we can do. Things we can't do. Okay? We also talk about can also mean permission. For example, this dog can eat everything, but he's not supposed to. So I might say, yeah, Benny can't eat everything. Benny has to eat only his dog food. Okay? Things we can do, things. So Benny can't eat everything. All right. Next, should. We use should to indicate what we are supposed to do, obligations. I should cuddle with my dogs all the time because they need it. Okay? Um, the verb plus infinitive form is ought to. We should exercise regularly. We ought to exercise regularly. We'd also use need and have to. Okay, all four of these really have the same meaning. Okay? We ought to exercise regularly to stay healthy. We need to exercise regularly to stay healthy. We have to exercise regularly to stay healthy. Notice should is the only one that doesn't have the word to before the word exercise. That's because it's the modal. Modals are not followed by infinitives like to exercise. They're followed by the base verb. Okay? Now, in a lot of grammar books, they will say that ought is actually a modal, but I disagree with that. I disagree with that, and I'll talk to you about why I disagree. But if you see something that I'm missing, please comment and ask the questions in the discussions or in the comments below, because I am more than happy to see things other ways. So we ought to exercise regularly daily. Let's make these into negative statements. We would say we should not, or we shouldn't. Okay. That's where we shouldn't exercise regularly. Okay. In this one, the reason people say that ought to is a modal is because we don't use the auxiliary do here. We would say ought not to exercise. And it's a little odd. In we need to and we have to, it works the same as every other simple one. It would say we don't need to exercise daily. We don't have to exercise daily. We're using the do auxiliary. And if you've seen my active verb tenses videos on present simple, you'll recognize this do, use of do in the negative. This is how we make these negative, but with we should, we don't use the do as the auxiliary. The should is the auxiliary. Okay, so because this is ought not, doesn't use the do, a lot of people will say, well, that means that it's already the auxiliary, which is true. Therefore, it must be the modal. However, I would argue it's not the modal because it still takes an infinitive after it rather than the base verb. And then we have then we have the question. And the question, we take the modal, we put it in the front. Should we exercise daily? Okay. Let's look at the other forms. Now remember, these are all They mean the same thing. This one, should, we use to give advice. We also use it, to express obligation. Okay, should we exercise regularly to stay healthy? Now, here, this is another argument for ought being a modal. This is, well, it's the same argument that ought acts as the auxiliary, therefore it must be the modal. However, you've heard my argument against. So this is how we would say it. Ought we to exercise regularly to stay healthy? And you should know that the use of ought is not very common. We don't use ought we hardly ever. So you will see it in the grammar books. It's not something you will hear very frequently. You will hear should, you will hear need to, and you will hear have to in this case. And we're going to turn these both into, so this would be, do we need to exercise regularly to stay healthy? I would say, do we have to exercise regularly to stay healthy? And these are all questions because they start with verbs and the answers are yes or no. Okay? The answers are yes or no. Yes. And the answers, actually, let's go into the answers a little bit. So, for should we exercise regularly, the answer is yes, we should. Ought we to exercise regularly? Yes, we ought to, or yes, we oughta. Okay, let me write those down. Yes, we ought to. And it sounds like oughta. Yes, we oughta. You hear older movies will say, why I oughta, meaning I'm going to beat you up. Why I oughta. He's using this, I ought to hit you. But we don't say that very often. Up here, we'd have yes, we should. And then both of these, let's see. Both of these will be yes, we do. Okay? Do we need to exercise regularly? Do we have to exercise regularly? The answer is yes, we do. Please understand that every time we answer a question, the short form of the question, we answer it with the auxiliary verb that we were asked with. That's why we have yes, we should, yes, we ought to, yes, we do, yes, we do. Okay? Hi. I really hope that you enjoyed this video about can and should. If you liked it, please like and subscribe. And if you want to learn more about what I'm doing to build my company, English in TheXarden, please go to my website, TheXarden.com, and sign up for our newsletter. Take a look at the things that we're working on. I hope to see you in the next video, and have a great day. Bye-bye.